everyone, in this video I'm going to speak about how to essentially download a large file from your server that is running on a website. So it could either be an IP address that is remote, or it could be the actual domain name that you're trying to access the file from, and essentially save that file onto your Cordova Android application. So in order to do this, within the document add event listener device ready event, the first step is essentially to make a request to retrieve the large file that you're trying to download. I've put in the description box a link that essentially explains the best way to download a file from a server. And the way it does does a special type of request that is usable in Cordova and is, in my opinion, the best way, or follows the best practice in order to download a file from the server. So essentially the way it works is you use this class called XML HTTP request. You set the URL you wish to get your file from, and in my case I'll be retrieving the file in blob format. So for those that don't know, blob is a data type. So in computing, blob stands for binary large object and is a data type used to store large unstructured binary data like images, audio, videos, and encrypted files in either databases or file systems. So this is perfect in order for us to retrieve the file in the format that we need and to be able to manipulate in the Android context that we are running under. So after you retrieve the file from your server in blob format, you can essentially run some code that will essentially verify if the data is not corrupted and is the actual data and is valid data, essentially how it's supposed to be. So I'll be having the code in a GitHub repo for you guys in order to look at the code that verifies the blob to test whether or not it's valid or not. So after retrieving the blob and seeing if it's valid or not, I essentially run it through a function that is assigned the task to save the blob into a file within the Android Cordova application context. So as you can see here, I run this function that has as a first parameter the blob data, and essentially this function will save the file, which in my case is an MP3 file, onto the Cordova file system, and to be more precise, it'll save it under the downloads file. So as you can see right here, this is the implementation I use in order to be able to save the blob into the file system in the Cordova Android application. And this wasn't the first implementation that I used. I used another implementation in the past and it did not work. It did not work because essentially Cordova context has some limitations when it comes to storing large files onto the file system in a Android application or operating system. So I needed to use another implementation. But the first implementation issue was, the Android context issue was essentially linked to memory management of the operating system and how Cordova used its internal code to be able to write the blob or the file onto the file system. So what was happening was that the app was essentially always crashing. So in order to fix this issue, you have to save the blob in chunks. That's the key solution to do so. So this enables the Android Cordova application to essentially have the time to read and write pieces of the file in blob format onto the file system, and to not have to do it in one go, which essentially breaks and makes the run or app crashes when you do so. So the entire implementation of the save file will be once again in the GitHub repo for you guys to access and to have a look at. But to quickly explain how it works is you need to define this Cordova file external root directory, which in my case will resolve directly to the downloads repository or folder. I named the file that I want to rename it as. In my case, it's an mp3 file, so I add the extension .mp3 at the end. I specified the chunk size of how I want to partition the blob file and save it within the Cordova context. So in my case, I want to make 1 megabyte query chunks, and that way that will enable me to save the file in 1 megabyte chunks essentially. And then I use this window.resolve local file system URL method. I specified the storage that I spoke about earlier. I access the file system in the callback method, and then as you see right here, I use a bunch of calls with their nested callback functions in order to get the file where it needs to be. So essentially I'll get your guys' attention within this write next chunk function right here that essentially writes the next chunk that needs to be written. And so it uses an offset and the blob to do a check and whether or not the file is completed or not. After it checks if it's not completed, it grabs a chunk from the blob, then it uses this on write end, essentially sets the offset to where it needs to be based on the new chunk size by iterating and incrementing it. Then it goes on to the write next chunk function once again, so it's a recursive function. And then if there's an error, it gets dealt with right here. If there's no error, it essentially recursively calls it again. And yeah, a bunch of error handling for each nested callback method or function, sorry. And what else can I say here? So after you set up your code as needed, you can go ahead to the config.xml file, which is the file that essentially manages the permissions and what is allowed from your Cordova application with your Android operating system. So this is the file that I used. Once again, it'll be in the GitHub repo, and I'll just grab your attention that I enabled these Android permissions right here, which are the Android permission .read external storage and the Android permission write external storage. So make sure these are in your config file. That way you'll be able to save the blob in chunks into have them essentially written onto the file. So to conclude, essentially this function saves the blob in chunks as opposed to saving it in one go, and this will essentially enable you to save your file into your Cordova Android application as opposed to doing it in one go, which creates internal memory management issues within the Cordova context, and having these memory management issues triggered will essentially make your Cordova application crash if you try to run it and save your file. So the key was saving it in chunks, and this essentially avoids your Cordova application to crash and using the save method and with the API request that I showed you earlier is essentially the entire process to get your file saved and downloaded as you need for your Cordova application. So with all that being said, I hope this video helps someone to get their download done for large files. More content is going to be produced, and thanks for watching. Take care and have a good day.